My name's Lou Harms and I'm the Chair and Head of Social Work at the University of Melbourne. On behalf of our department, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 2021 Len Tierney Lecture. I welcome you all here as our social work alumni, our past students and past staff, our current students and staff, our many colleagues across the School of Health Sciences, the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences, across the university, across our partner organisations, and to you all as our wider community of family and friends. And I warmly welcome in particular members of Dr. Len Tierney's family who join us on this occasion each year. To Michael, Nathan, Lachlan Tierney and many others of you who are here with us, we welcome you. And Michael in particular, I'd like to acknowledge your sustained connection with our department and your father, Len Tierney. I want to also acknowledge as we gather here in our various places that most of us are gathering on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the custodians of this land on which I stand and many others of us do for tens of thousands of years. I pay my deep respects to their elders past and present, and to the elders and to the traditions of the lands on where you may also be located today. I also pay respect to our Indigenous colleagues and students who are here with us today and affirm our commitment to the allyship and partnership in all that we do together. As many of you know, the Len Tierney Lecture is a significant event in the annual calendar of our department, and tonight is a particularly significant one. It's the third event in our 80th anniversary year, our 80th year of celebration of social work education at the University of Melbourne. And so as our third 80th anniversary event this year, tonight is without question, I think, our largest event, not only of our 80th celebrations, but of any of our former Len Tierney lectures. So it forms a record for us in our gathering here today. There are more than 470 people who've registered to be part of this webinar, either today as we talk or to listen at a later time and perhaps in another part of the world. But this is all about our community coming together to celebrate our 80th year. It's also one of the silver linings of COVID, if there are such things. This online life, I think, gives us the opportunity to connect in so many different ways and with such a much wider global audience for these events and many other things. And I think the other reason we have some 470 people registered, of course, is the very high interest in the topic that we explore today. I'll say a little bit about our order of proceedings and our speakers in a moment, but I did just want to do a few housekeeping matters about this webinar. So the session is being recorded and we'll circulate the email link within the next 1 or 2 weeks for you to listen again or to share with other people. And it will also be available at our alumni website from the social work department. Secondly, as audience members, I can assure each one of you that your camera is off and you are muted and you will remain that way throughout the webinar. So the only people that will be heard and seen throughout this event are the panellists here that you see today. At the end, though, or throughout, we invite you to post your questions on the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And if we do have time for questions, we'll put them to our speakers here. So please put those into the Q&A session there. And if we can't respond to them or can't respond to all of them, we'll make the commitment to do that in our post-event communications with you. So today not only gives us the opportunity to celebrate the enduring legacy of Dr. Len Tierney, it's an opportunity for us to publicly announce our new disability research hub that's formed with the Melbourne Disability Institute at the University of Melbourne, and you'll hear more about that throughout the webinar. And this research partnership is really about growing our capacity and impact in disability and inclusion research. It's enabling research engagement also with the broader School of Health Sciences, which we're part of, other university researchers, and of course our key hospitals and community organisations. So we launched this partnership through this webinar space because tonight's webinar highlights a major theme of our disability research agenda. That agenda is about enhancing the lives of children with disability and enhancing the lives of the families around them. It's about ensuring their lives are full and rich lives and well supported beyond the family by communities, by social workers, by the many other health and social care professionals that are around them, and all of our formal and informal systems of care. And so this research work is fundamentally about enabling children's rights to be fully realised, about ensuring the safety for all children, and of course enhancing families' strengths and capacity to thrive. So I'm delighted in launching that, in celebrating our 80th and in formally giving the Len Tierney Lecture this year through Lyndall Hickey, that we can speak to those important themes here with you today. And I'm delighted that 4 outstanding people have agreed to be part of this discussion. So by brief introduction, Emeritus Professor Dorothy Scott, AM, who almost needs no introduction in our audience. Dorothy, of course, taught within our department for some 20 years. She's a former head of department. She's also a postgraduate student of Len Tierney, as well as a long-term colleague of his. Dorothy went on to be the Foundation Chair in Child Protection and the Director of the Australian Centre for Child Protection at the University of South Australia. Amongst many other commitments in what might be called some people's ongoing working life, not retirement, Dorothy remains very actively engaged with our discipline of social work and also her deep concerns in child and family welfare. So Dorothy most appropriately will speak to Len Tierney's legacy tonight. Then following that, our keynote address is given by Dr. Lyndall Hickey. And in focusing on the theme of children and disability, Lyndall's drawing on her really extensive clinical and management experience as a social worker. Her more than 25 years of professional working life to date has been fundamentally focused on optimising the health and wellbeing of children and families, and that's been wherever she's worked. So that's be that at MacKillop Family Services, the Royal Children's Hospital, or the Bouverie Centre. So we're delighted that on completion of her PhD, she moved across to join our department as a research fellow, and here she's over these last few years been rapidly advancing her research commitments in the disability field. She also teaches across our research subjects and across our child and family curriculum. So no better person came to mind to speak to this topic this evening. And tonight she's going to share some of her lessons from practice that can in turn, I think, inform richly all of our ongoing research and practice commitments with children and families. Then to respond and build on those ideas, Professor Bruce Bonahady is joining the discussion. Bruce is currently the Executive Chair and the inaugural Director of the Melbourne Disability Institute here at the University of Melbourne. But as you all will know, and perhaps most importantly, Bruce is one of the key architects of our National Disability Insurance Scheme. And he was the inaugural chair of the National Disability Insurance Agency from 2013 to 2016. His advocacy for and his leadership in this space mean that he is widely regarded as the father of the NDIS. And much of that in many ways also comes from Bruce being a father of 3 adult sons, 2 of whom have disabilities. But it's also that advocacy that he's taken much further and nationally and internationally with all of that work. And his 2010 Queen's Birthday Honour, where he was appointed a member of the Order of Australia, really recognised his service to people with disabilities, their families and their carers, and also to the community that he's contributed to through so much of his charitable organisations' support work. And one of those main things being that he's a former president of Philanthropy Australia. So Bruce, I think it's a privilege for all of us to work with you on a near daily basis, given all of that. And I think it's important to note on this occasion that Bruce has supported social work research over many years in different ways. And so both Bruce and Dorothy were instrumental in securing the philanthropic support for the appointment of Professor Kathy Humphries to the Felton Chair of Child and Family Welfare. And so we thank you also, Bruce, for your ongoing support of our social work research agenda over many years. So following Lyndall and Bruce's presentation, Janet Farrow, OAM, will speak to you briefly, and she's as the president of our University of Melbourne Social Work Alumni Association. Janet has had an outstanding social work career, whether that be as a social work advocate, manager, leader, but particularly bringing all of those to reform in the areas of mental health, substance abuse, and reform in the justice system. And so we're very fortunate as a department not only to have you, Janet, as a teaching academic, but also as our Alumni Association president. And so Janet's been invited to give the vote of thanks tonight to Lyndall and Bruce, and to also highlight some of the ways in which you as our audience can link with us and support our further work. So let's move into those next proceedings. To set the scene for the Len Tierney Lecture tonight, I'll now call on Emeritus Professor Dorothy Scott.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you for the warm welcome. It is indeed an honour to say a few words about Dr. Len Tierney at this lecture in his name. And I warmly acknowledge the presence of Len's family members and his closest friends. Many of you will have known Len Tierney in his lifetime, but many of you may not. And so I want to say a little about him. Born in 1925 in Melbourne, Len Tierney grew up on a soldier settlement farm in the Mallee, hard hit by drought and the 1930s depression. Len knew firsthand about adversity from a very young age. He also knew firsthand about the resilience of families and the resilience of communities, and he knew about service to the community. His family modelled that. With the support of many scholarships, he came to the University of Melbourne to study arts and social work in 1946, and later undertook postgraduate studies at Columbia University in New York. Len Tierney was the head of the School of Social Work for much of the 1960s through to the 1980s. There was great depth and breadth to his scholarship. He understood the importance of responding to the needs of individuals and families, right through to the importance of developing and implementing excellent programs and policies underpinned by good research. Practice, program, policy, research, the nexus of that. His interests ranged over several fields, but his special area of interest was child welfare. His seminal book, Children Who Need Help, published in 1963, significantly contributed to the reform of child welfare in Victoria, in particular to the deinstitutionalisation of child welfare and the development of services to prevent children coming into the care of the state and to assist those children where it was safe to do so to return home. I remember the child welfare system in the 1970s, and I remember the number of children with a disability who were in some of those institutions. And of course, to us today, we look back on that generation and we are perplexed that so many children with a disability would have spent so long their formative years in institutional care. Len taught his students to see the child in the context of the family, in the family's social network, in the family's community, in the wider society. That overarching perspective, I think, speaks to children with a disability as it does children who are vulnerable to abuse and neglect. And it always included the extended family. He did not think of the family as a household, but as a web of relationships based on enduring bonds of attachment. Len had some wonderfully pithy sayings, and I'm only going to share one that he said to me once almost as a reprimand. Well, it was a reprimand, let's be honest. He once said to me, "There are states of affairs as well as states of mind, Dorothy." He was warning me about the dangers of becoming so immersed in the psychological, so immersed in the world of emotions, that I was forgetting the situational realities of day-to-day life, of housing, work, income, neighbourhood, and many other social factors. And I think they're wise words, and I've always learned that lesson, I hope. In 2019, a group of Len Tierney's former colleagues and students wrote the book, A Love of Truth and a Love of Service, the social work legacy of Len Tierney. The phrase, a love of truth and a love of service, came from his own words, and it was his calling to serve in a way that was based on knowledge. Let us not lose sight of that vision. Len Tierney was a generous man. In his lifetime and in a bequest he left to the University of Melbourne, the Len Tierney Travelling Award, which will enable students and recent graduates to have an opportunity similar to that which he had early in his career. While the COVID pandemic has prevented it being awarded this year, it is hoped that it will be awarded next year, and that all those who receive this award will stand on his shoulders. Thank you. And I now welcome Dr. Lyndall Hickey to give this year's Len Tierney Lecture.
Thank you, Dorothy. Before I begin, I too would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri elders of this land. I would like to thank Professor Lou Harms and the University of Melbourne Social Work Alumni for inviting me to speak today. It is my honour to present the Len Tierney Lecture, and I warmly welcome Len's immediate and extended family members here with us today. I would also like to acknowledge the wealth of expertise here in this webinar, people with disability and their families, and many other colleagues from social work, medical, nursing, and allied health. In this presentation, I will discuss Len Tierney's integrative approach to social work theory, practice, and research that informs significant policy reform for children and families in Victoria. It is an approach that has had an enduring influence on my social work career. I will share some of the many lessons I have learned from children and families through 25 years of practice in family preservation, health, and disability. Through practice, I have come to understand that child health and wellbeing outcomes are inextricably linked to their family context. I will be sharing how these lessons have come to inform my child and family disability research. And I will be highlighting 4 of my key research projects which aim to enhance our collective understanding and practice when working with children and young adults with disabilities and their families, and the impact of the communities and systems that surround them. Finally, drawing on these practice lessons and research directions, I will consider how person and family-centred principles can be integrated into policies that have the potential to shape the future disability landscape in Australia. In preparing for this presentation, I came to understand the strong connection between Len Tierney's conceptualisation of family and community and society and my early social work practice development and subsequent research interests. Len Tierney laid the conceptual foundations for improving the lives of children and families involved with St Anthony's in Footscray. This work was embedded in practice long before I began working at the Family Preservation Service at St Anthony's in 2000. However, the legacy of this work was woven into the fabric of every program and practice intention. Len's teachings describe the importance of developing a shared understanding with families. Families facing significant challenges, often putting the children and the integrity of the family system at risk. Family violence, abuse and neglect, alcohol and other drug use, housing instability, and environmental neglect were common reasons for referral to the Family Preservation Service. As a social worker working with children at risk and their families, I learned how to apply the systemic understanding of family and community in society, working with the strengths and capacities of families despite their adverse circumstances and the contextual factors that impacted on their lives. Exploration of a family's issues revealed entrenched intergenerational problems, the systemic barriers compounding these problems, and the ways of working together to find solutions. Listening carefully and raising questions that led to answers and revelations for them and me. Revelations that brought forward clues for guiding the next steps, the kernel of truth from which action would come. I learned about the complexity of family systems and the nuanced ways in which strengths could be leveraged to achieve change. The Family Preservation Service at St Anthony's gave me a foundation for my social work practice with families. It sparked my interest in practice-based research, further training in family therapy, and policy roles in health and human services. This was the beginning of my integrative approach, bringing together my practice, research, and policy directions for children with disabilities and their families. So what are some of the lessons I've learned in practice when working with children and adults with disability and their families? This diagram shows a summary of the lessons I have learned. The inner circle highlights the key lessons taught to me by the children and families. The outer circle is the overarching motivation for me as a social work practitioner and researcher to optimise health and well-being and centre the expertise of children and families. As I share my experiences working with children and families in practice, these lessons in the diagram will emerge. Whether as a parent, child, or practitioner, we know that disability has a significant impact on the individual and their family throughout the lifespan. There is often little or no preparation for parents and family members when a child is diagnosed with a congenital or acquired disability. We know that families are often catapulted into a crisis at this time. The family system experiences a different instability and uncertainty, which challenges its sense of predictability and safety. The expectations to adjust and adapt are unrelenting. The integrity of the family and the extended family structures is placed under considerable strain. Too often, parents do not receive the support they need to move from grief and anger to acceptance and joy. When not addressed, it can lead to ongoing adversity and challenges. This was one of the very important lessons I learned from working with families at the Bouverie Centre. Many of these families had an adult family member with an acquired brain injury that was sustained in childhood. They were presenting with entrenched, problematic issues, often tied to the legacy of the initial disability diagnosis. It was often another crisis for the adult with ABI and their family that prompted them to seek professional help. This work highlighted to me the importance of working with individuals and families early and proactively in their disability journey. Early in the disability journey to enable them to better understand their experiences and potentially prevent the manifestation of longer term and more significant problems. The opportunity to work proactively with families at the early phase in their disability journey came at the Royal Children's Hospital. At the RCH, I listened and worked with family members as they explored their emotional responses to their child's disability. This taught me about the ambivalence experience. Parents often perplexed by their own descriptions of joy, hope, anger, and grief. What their child's disability means for the child and the family, now and in the future. Another lesson for me was that as family members share their individual responses to their child's disability, it becomes apparent that this work needs to occur within the context of family adaptation and functioning. Families examine how their family worked before the child's diagnosis, how the family responds in relation to the diagnosis, and how the family can work together in the future. This is a complex and challenging process. It is one that prompts families to proactively determine their next steps. The key part of this process reveals to families their own expert knowledge about their child and how their family works. Families as experts, working in family-centred models of practice, adept at identifying the strengths of the child and family, drawing on their own strengths so they can engage in collaborative problem solving and decision making. They can successfully plan a way forward to redefine and re-establish stability for their family system. When successful at this, it can create a stable yet adaptive system. I learned that a family's self-awareness of their expert knowledge also gives them the skills to recognise when other resources and systems are needed. Resources and systems for optimal child health and wellbeing outcomes. Families learn the complex task of navigating the systems that provide such resources and learning what levers to pull to access these resources. As we're all aware, there are a multitude of transitions for child and family throughout life. Transition to and between health and education systems, transition from childhood to adulthood, transitions to changes in living arrangements and care. These are all examples of the anticipatory changes that lie ahead in family life. In my practice, and also now in my research, I often wonder how children with disability and their families prepare and move through these transitions. Is this process viewed through a developmental lens or a disability lens, or both? Of all the lessons I've learned, the most important is collaborating with families. For me, person and family-centred principles inform this collaboration. They bring together the collective wisdom of the child, family, social work, and other health professionals and systems as a team. I believe this is essential if we are to optimise the health and wellbeing trajectories of children with disability and their families. Closely aligned to Len's integrative approach, I've sought to embed all these lessons from practice into my research. My belief is that further exploration and expansion of these lessons will give a contemporary perspective and build knowledge to inform future practice research and policy directions. I now want to highlight 4 of these projects and how this integration is happening. Each of these projects link with one or more of the lessons. The first project I would like to share focuses on the days, weeks, and months that follow a diagnosis of a child's disability. As flagged earlier, the magnitude of this crisis event is such that the family system is likely to need additional resources, regardless of how well it functions, to make the necessary changes needed to begin the process of redefining and re-establishing its new identity. Based on my research at the RCH, I learned that families are responsive to early social work intervention through the input of additional psychosocial resources. By delivering a social work intervention focused on how the family functions, I observed families change the way they worked together. Through this proactive intervention, families with poorer functioning were identified and provided with more social work resources and practical resources to support their adaptation. These families reported positive outcomes in managing their child's disability care. Parents were satisfied with how they were working together in the early weeks of caring for their child at home. Building on that early family adaptation intervention research and connecting to the transitions lesson, the second project, Caring for a Child with Disability and Family Life, will learn more about family adaptiveness over the longer term. Based at the RCH, families will be telling us about how they function and manage the care of their child with a disability within the context of everyday family life. The findings of this study will inform how families move along a continuum from being focused on their child's care to focused on family life, and how this is influenced by the age of the child, the type and severity of disability diagnosis, and the period living with disability within the family context. This knowledge will also provide important insights into how families can anticipate and prepare for future crises, challenges, and transitions. The third project involves young adults with cerebral palsy and touches on many of the lessons as illustrated in this diagram. I spoke earlier of the ambivalent emotional responses of individuals within the family system at key transition points. This is particularly so for young people with disability who are seeking increased independence from within a family system. In different family systems, independence, codependence, and dependence can hold different meanings. Mixed emotional responses, all of which are valid, need to be explored and understood to inform the next steps for a successful transition. Understanding transitions such as these in practice is the impetus for research in this area. In collaboration with young people with cerebral palsy, their families, health professionals, and research partners at MCRI and St Vincent's, we will be exploring family processes undertaken by young people with cerebral palsy and family members when considering a transition to independent living. Independent living will be examined through developmental and disability lenses. Through this research inquiry, we will gain insight into the family, community, and complex service systems that promote or hinder young adults with CP to live independently. The fourth project explores pathways to gymnastics for children with disabilities. This research highlighted the importance of community inclusion and resources in children's lives. It explored the lessons of proactive support for families and navigating complex systems. Issues of inclusion and equity have always been at the forefront of social work practice. I was fortunate to be invited into this collaboration with the Department of Physiotherapy and Gymnastics Victoria to learn more about inclusiveness, issues of equity and access for children with disabilities wanting to participate in gymnastics. In this study, families told us the pathways to their child's participation in gymnastics was often difficult and challenging. Access for children wanting to be involved in a program was highly dependent on the additional funding resources needed for one-on-one coaching or care support. Only a small number of families in this study were successful in obtaining the funding needed to support their child's enrolment or ongoing participation in gymnastics. While there were some positive stories about inclusive practices implemented by gymnastics clubs, it is apparent that there is further work to be done in this area. We need to improve access for children with disabilities to participate in activities such as gymnastics that can deliver optimal health and wellbeing outcomes in safe and inclusive spaces. To do this, we'll be drawing on the expert knowledge of those families who successfully navigated a pathway for their child to share with other families and service providers. In highlighting these 4 projects, my intention has been to show the complexities and strengths for children and families adjusting to and living with disabilities. This is a time of rapid change in the disability policy landscape, and so while some issues are new, others are enduring. Len Tierney's career spanned a period of major social reform in health and welfare systems, largely driven by changes in societal attitudes and the need to address social injustice that delivered significant policy milestones in the child and family space. He was instrumental in transformational reform related to children at risk and the development of holistic, family-centred services such as St Anthony's and beyond. As social workers, we want to work with individuals with disability and their families within a contemporary context. To do so, we need to understand the current issues within the disability landscape. In Australia, we are living through one of the most significant disability reforms. The National Disability Insurance Scheme was designed to give people with disabilities choice and control over the support and services they receive to help achieve their goals. While the operational rollout of the scheme was completed in the past 2 years, it has been altering the disability landscape for over a decade. This landscape has been shaped by expectations of individuals with disability, their families, communities, systems, services, and policies. Decisions were made at the micro, meso, and macro levels in anticipation of the changes and challenges that lay ahead. The positive and negative impacts of these decisions are continuing to reverberate and are indeed changing the disability landscape. The introduction of this scheme has created shockwaves that has challenged the integrity and stability of many systems, including the family. The magnitude of this challenge will take the collective effort of people with disability, families, researchers, practitioners, systems, and policymakers to shape the disability landscape and its interactions with other service systems. Person-centred and family-centred principles, driven again by changes in societal attitudes and the need to address social injustice, need to inform all aspects of policy development in the disability space. Finally, social work can play its role in supporting disability reform by strengthening rights-based practices and supporting mechanisms that ensure safe and inclusive communities. I would like to now call upon Professor Bruce Bonahady of the Melbourne Disability Institute for his response and how we can build upon these ideas further.
Thank you, Lyndall. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all of the lands on which we are meeting tonight and to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. It's a great privilege to be invited to respond to and build on Dr. Hickey's Len Tierney Lecture and to be part of this year's celebration of 80 years of social work at the University of Melbourne. It's a time to reflect on and celebrate the extraordinary contributions that have been made by the graduates of this department to a fairer and more equitable Australia. In preparing for tonight's lecture, I've been inspired by Dr. Tierney's compassion and respect for excluded families, struggling with the many crises of daily living, and the groundbreaking family in community in society vision and model he established at St Anthony's over 40 years ago. His enduring impact is a powerful example of how we all stand on the shoulders of the giants who came before us. Dr. Hickey in her lecture tonight has identified how the legacy of Dr. Tierney lives on in her work through her deep commitment to family-centred practice when supporting children with disabilities and how child outcomes are inextricably linked to their family context. It's clear that her social work practice extends the groundbreaking reforms led by Dr. Tierney into supporting children with disabilities and their families. It's also clear from the examples that Dr. Hickey has shared that social workers can earn a position of deep trust with families and that respect and collaboration are at the centre of these relationships. As the parent of now 3 adult sons, 2 of whom have disabilities, I know how much we as a family have benefited from the social workers who have supported us. I also now know that our first social worker was a student of Dr. Tierney's. My wife and I owe her, and therefore Dr. Tierney, an enduring debt of gratitude. She was the person we turned to when we first became concerned that our first child might have been born with a disability. Reflecting on Dr. Tierney's groundbreaking work with disadvantaged families, it's clear that vision, research, evidence, and deeply respectful partnerships with disadvantaged people all played a part in the transformational changes that he initiated. Vision, research, evidence, and partnerships with people with disability, their families, and carers have been central to the development of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, or NDIS. 15 years ago, I became deeply interested in the idea that disability could be reframed as an investment or insurance issue rather than a welfare issue. It's a powerful vision which has united the disability community and is based on equity. A vision that every Australian should have the same opportunity, regardless of whether or not they have a disability, and people with disability should be full citizens. Throughout the conceptualisation and design of the NDIS, there was a commitment to best evidence, and people with disability, their families and carers were deeply engaged in true co-design. Today, there are more than 460,000 participants in the NDIS. More than one half are receiving supports for the first time. It's a nation-changing reform which now stands side by side with Medicare. But while it is transforming many lives, it is not working for everyone, especially those experiencing multiple disadvantages. More needs to be done, especially through research, better evidence, and co-design. Tonight, I would therefore like to build on Dr. Hickey's lecture, Dr. Tierney's legacy, and my experiences with the NDIS to put forward the case for new social work evidence and research, which puts people with disability and their families at the centre of the research and future disability policy and practice improvements. At the Melbourne Disability Institute, our vision is to transform the social and economic well-being and the health of people with disability through high-quality research, teaching, and knowledge translation. As an interdisciplinary research institute, our role is to act as a catalyst, to engage with researchers across the university, to motivate our best and brightest researchers, and to help create environments in which they will thrive. But that is only half of the equation. We want to bring researchers together with people with disability, their families, and their representative organisations to make sure the research is driven by their priorities and will make a difference to their lives. This is about establishing genuine collaborative partnerships which will produce research and evidence that will address the many challenges that people with disability and their families continue to face every day in this country. Since the establishment of MDI, we've been very successful in building external partnerships. Our major partners are governments, philanthropy, disability service providers, and disability representative organisations. Together, we have had significant impact. Last year, MDI partnered with the Summer Foundation to undertake research which demonstrated that the benefits of mandatory accessible standards for housing would significantly exceed the costs. We also established the Building Better Homes campaign, which has grown to an alliance of more than 80 organisations. Earlier this year, governments responded to the evidence and campaign and agreed to introduce mandatory accessible standards for all new housing into the National Construction Code. This reform will not only benefit people with disability, but also older Australians wishing to age in place. It will future-proof Australia's housing stock and is another example of how research, evidence, and genuine partnerships can make Australia a more inclusive and fairer society. A second major initiative, which is being led by MDI, is a feasibility study on the establishment of a National Disability Research Partnership, or NDRP, which has been funded by the Commonwealth Government. Key deliverables of NDRP include developing a 10-year national research agenda in collaboration with people with disability, their families and carers. Once this research agenda is completed, Australia will have a research agenda which reflects priorities of people with disability, their families and representative organisations for the first time. It will therefore put people with disability and their families at the centre of future disability research. Our hope is that based on its success, governments will establish NDRP as a permanent feature in the national disability landscape, and it will provide significant additional funding for disability research. A new Australian disability strategy is also due to be finalised later this year. This will set out an overarching framework supporting all Australians with a disability and align with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. The NDRP is then expected to play a key role in ensuring that the outcomes of the Australian Disability Strategy and the vision of the NDIS are achieved. It will be a rich time to engage in high-impact disability research. However, from a University of Melbourne perspective, to fully contribute to these reforms, we need to build capacity and capability within the university. This work is underway, and for the past year, MDI has been working with faculty, schools, and departments to build what we are calling disability research hubs. We're delighted that the first disability research hub has been established in the Department of Social Work. This hub is being led by Professor Lou Harms, and I would like to thank her for championing disability research within social work. Already, we're building new research capability, attracting external partners, and engaging Masters of Social Work students in the research. However, there is much more that needs to be done to ensure a stronger family focus in disability policy and practice. To illustrate this need, I would like to focus on early childhood, early intervention services under the NDIS. Before the introduction of the NDIS, disability services took a short to medium term and welfare approach, rather than a lifetime and investment approach. Funding depended on a medical diagnosis, with children with autism, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, and a number of other conditions receiving funding, while other children received nothing. It was a deeply unfair and inefficient system. With the introduction of the NDIS, it was hoped that early intervention would be national and fair and rely on the best evidence to inform and continuously improve practices. However, unfortunately, early childhood, early intervention is one aspect of the NDIS which has not lived up to its promise. We know that children learn best when they are in loving and supported environments. However, early intervention under the NDIS has failed to recognise that it must not just focus on the child. Families must also be nurtured and sustained in their caring roles. We know that family-centred practice, supported through a key worker, leads to the best long-term outcomes. Instead, we have seen medical models dominate under the NDIS, leading to an almost insatiable appetite for early intervention services, which threatens the sustainability of the scheme. It's regrettable that the NDIS has failed to implement the basic family-centred practice that was so central to the work of Dr. Tierney. The National Disability Insurance Agency has also failed to gather the best research and evidence, or to engage with families and their representative organisations in true co-design, or to harness the expertise of early childhood, early intervention community organisations. Now, evidence, partnerships and co-design must be used to ensure that the vision of best practice early childhood, early intervention is achieved through the NDIS. Only then will every child born with a disability have the best chance to reach their potential. Making a major contribution to this process is therefore one reason why MDI is delighted to be working with the Department of Social Work to establish a new chair in disability and families. As Lou mentioned in her introduction, nearly 20 years ago, I was a member of the Felton Bequests Committee when Professor Dorothy Scott approached us in our centenary year and proposed the establishment of the Felton Bequests Chair in Child and Family Welfare. Now, looking back and seeing the groundbreaking work that has been undertaken by the inaugural Felton Bequests Chair, Professor Kathy Humphreys, it's clear that this was an inspirational suggestion. A chair in disability and families would also lead to transformational change for families experiencing disability. It would lead to new opportunities to place people with disability and their families at the centre of research, and new partnerships with disability representatives and community organisations. It would stand on the shoulders of Dr. Len Tierney and all those other pioneers of social change and equity from this great department. It would be a platform for further groundbreaking improvements in disability policy and practice. And so there could be no better way of creating an enduring legacy to celebrate 80 years of social work. I would now like to invite Janet Farrow, President of the Alumni Association, to formally launch the campaign to establish a chair in disability and families in the Department of Social Work. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bruce. Look, it falls to me, and it's a lovely job, to offer a vote of thanks to our speakers tonight. And firstly, I'd just like to thank Lou Harms for so richly setting the scene for tonight's Len Tierney Lecture. The important work that we've done in this field, the important research, the practice with families that is behind us, but that which lays ahead of us. Dorothy, thank you so much for graciously honouring the memory of Len Tierney in ways that no other person seems to be able to do. It was marvellous. And it's, of course, the reason that we have this lecture. And again, Lyndall, what a marvellous lecture. It was just a delight to listen to. And you're so sort of generous and sensitive in the way that you share the work that you've done. And I know it must have been incredibly difficult for those families, but boy, it's difficult for the professionals involved as well. And you just very richly portrayed all of that. And I think, you know, what a wonderful person to have in our department with this research agenda that we've got before us. I just couldn't think of a better person to be driving that. So just congratulations for a wonderful, wonderful lecture. Bruce, you are a true friend of the profession, and we really appreciate that. We appreciate so much about what you have to offer, both in a personal sense, an experiential sense, but in a professional sense. We just couldn't have a better friend than you. And I think that idea of bringing this partnership together between the department and the Melbourne Disability Institute, it's looking at scholarship that finds its true meaning in making a difference in people's lives. That's what we honour, and it's just fabulous. So we could have great influence, I think. So it falls to me, and again, this is a happy task, to really support, to really illuminate why we are supporting this campaign to establish a chair in disability and families, if that isn't already fairly obvious from tonight's offering. In preparation for this, we've worked with the Melbourne Disability Institute to prepare a case for support document. What I'm going to do now is in the chat function, I'm going to paste a link to a very flash thing called a Padlet, and it has the document, which is the case for supporting the establishment of this chair. For those of you who are interested and able to support this initiative, we invite you to consider endowing this unique professorial role. Once established, that chair would lead the research agenda so that an evidence base is developed that's capable of providing practical solutions for families and advice to service providers, policymakers and regulators. So please do have a look at that document. You'll also find information or a link to our alumni website, and I invite you to have a look at that. But you'll also find information on how to purchase a copy of A Love of Truth and a Love of Service, the social work legacy of Len Tierney. And I think he's had a wonderful honouring tonight. It's just a thread that's a golden thread that's come through all of our presentations. Now I'd like to hand over to Lou Harms, who's going to offer some concluding remarks. And if we've got time, we can have a look at any questions that you might have. Thanks, Lou.
Thank you, Janet. Yes, it's been an extraordinary discussion, and I think we walk away with many thoughts and actions at the ready. And I think for me, taking that central theme of both Lyndall's conversation and Bruce's is the theme of being early in support and intervention and being family-centred in everything we do, and collaboration at the heart of what we do. So I think that those three themes have in many ways been touched on so deeply tonight. We hope you'll take those and many with you as you go. I can't see any questions in our question Q&A box there at the moment. So as Janet has done, I'll invite you to add one there in our last minute or two. And as you're having a think, I will just point to our next and final event for the year with our 80th anniversary celebrations. So the fourth event will be on November the 25th. And it's a launch of the Alumni Oral History Project. Some of you in the audience may already have been involved in this project, but led by Associate Professor Ralph Hampson, many of our very prominent alumni and our Master of Social Work students. This has been a way of tracking the oral history of social work over the past decades. So November the 25th is that occasion. We'll be in touch with you about that event. And I think in the absence of any questions posted there, we will move to closing the proceedings. And so in doing so, I want to thank all of our speakers tonight, Dorothy, Lyndall, Bruce and Janet. I want to thank Mel Schmidt, who's behind the scenes and has been managing the registrations, been managing the webinar tonight. Who would have thought we'd have to have an earthquake contingency plan? All of those things have come to play, but I think despite our current context, the conversation has gone extremely well. So thank you all for being a part of it, part of the audience, part of the panel, and this brings our webinar this evening to an end.